Alright, so now we're in our third section of part one notes. We just got done talking about intramembranous ossification, which is the bone formation in the womb of flat bones, like the bones of the skull, which are a big one, the ribs, scapula, things like that. But now we're going to get into the actual bone formation of the large majority of the rest of the bones in your body, which is called endochondral ossification. So just like before, you have to know the steps of intramembranous ossification. In this particular section, one of the big things you have to do is you have to know what the steps of endochondral ossification are, and then you have to understand how each of the role players, or understand how that process works together to actually form the bones in the body in the womb, and how that process continues outside the womb to increase the growth of the skeleton throughout your life. So here we go. Endochondral ossification, how it starts is it starts off with what is called a bone model. The model is essentially, if you remember that picture I showed you of a baby in the womb, where it had the features of a human being, but you could not see any bone or definitive actual hardcore features. They just looked like a rounded mass of what should be arms and legs and head and things like that. Well, endochondral ossification is basically takes that cartilage model, or the beginning portion, and it changes that cartilage into bone, forming the framework for the body. Most of your skeletal bones in your body are actually formed from endochondral ossification, and then so intramembranous ossification, the one we talked about in part B, is actually one that doesn't occur as frequently because there aren't as many flat bones as there are long bones, short bones, and irregular bones. So let's go through the steps very briefly, and then in here in a second I'll show you a little movie and kind of clarify some things for you. So chondrocytes, remember that the model that it starts off with, or the its beginning framework for the body, is actually starts off as cartilage. So those cartilage cells that had built that model or framework, what they actually do is they start to go through what is called hypertrophy, which is the enlarging of the cells, and they actually enlarge and calcify. Then what you have is you have stem cells that are inside of that bone model that actually, remember, stem cells are cells that aren't told what they're supposed to be yet. Those stem cells actually start to differentiate. So in their DNA, some of the genes start getting turned off, and the ones that are left on are the ones that say, hey, you are supposed to be an osteoblast. So those stem cells form into osteoblasts, which are the bone-building cells. And what they start doing is they start taking that calcium from the blood system and actually start forming the bone matrix. This actually occurs mostly around the outside edge, or the shaft or diaphysis of the bone. This forms what is called the bone collar. We'll get into that here in just a little bit, but you have this slow changing of the cartilage into bone through osteoblasts. Spongy bone is one of the first things that is formed, and it's formed in a very, very center of the shaft, which ends up becoming called the primary ossification center. So bone growth actually occurs from the middle out. So you have these chondrocytes that enlarged right in the middle of the bone shaft. They enlarged and calcified. The reason they calcify is because when those osteoblasts increase their activity around the outside of the shaft of the bone, it actually inhibits the chondrocytes from obtaining nutrients, and that's what causes them to calcify. This center action here becomes what is called the primary center of ossification, and this spongy bone formation that occurs through the activity of osteoblasts continues and continues, but it continues down the length of the bone towards both epiphysis centers. And what it does is it fills the shaft with spongy bone. As that shaft is filling with spongy bone, you have the osteoblasts working on the outside that are forming the compact bone on the shaft of the diaphysis. Okay. As the bone enlarges in length, because you got to remember that it starts at that primary ossification center in the middle of the diaphysis and works and continually forms more and more and more and more bones in an outward or longitudinal, I guess you could say, direction, the lengthwise of the bone, continually creating. Now, what also happens there is you have the increased activity of osteoclasts. The osteoclasts start working on that spongy bone on the inside of that diaphysis, which ends up forming your medullary cavity, which is going to be end up being filled with bone marrow, or it's also called the bone marrow. And as it works towards the outside, the chondrocytes on the outside portion of where it's growing continue to form cartilage, and it continues to add them at the ends. Now, as that cartilage is added at the end, and as bone is built from the middle out, bones get longer and longer and longer. That's why in the womb, babies continue to grow, and this actually continues outside of the body, which we'll get into, or not outside of the body, outside of the womb, which we'll get into in just one moment. But so then what you have is you have the center of the epiphysis. That process on each epiphysis, that process actually starts to occur again. So you have the penetration of blood vessels in there, forming what are called secondary ossification centers, and both of those are on the epiphysis of each bone, or the very, very ends. And with those secondary ossification centers, that process starts over again, where the osteoblasts start forming the spongy bone, and that's what creates the spongy bone centers at the ends of each of the bones, or the epiphysis. Now that cartilage, as it slowly gets pushed and pushed and pushed and grows and grows and grows towards the epiphysis of each of the bone, some of it actually remains on the outer covering of the bone. That is what is forming your articular cartilage, or the cartilage that occurs between bone joints. But also at the ends of the bones, or at the epiphysis, you end up with what are called the epiphyseal plates, which are the growth plates of your bone. That epiphyseal plate is what contributes to the growth of your body and your skeletal system throughout puberty and throughout your life until you reach the time in your life where you actually stop growing. So let's watch this quick movie here.
While flat bones are formed through intramembranous ossification, most bones in the body, such as the long bones of the legs and arms, are formed in a somewhat different manner known as endochondral ossification. This type of bone development involves cartilage models, which are eventually replaced with bony tissue. The process begins in the developing fetus and can be divided into several stages. Around the 8th week of development, chondroblasts begin secreting a cartilaginous matrix that will form the hyaline cartilage model for bone development.
So what they're describing here is actually what occurs is at what I believe they said 8 weeks in development, you have the chondrocytes that form the model, or the beginning of what should be your skeletal system.
As with other hyaline cartilage tissues, chondrocytes are trapped in lacunae, and a perichondrium surrounds the model. The next stage begins when chondrocytes within the center of the model hypertrophy.
Hypertrophy. So what they're showing here is that chondrocyte model that forms. So your bones start off as chondrocytes, and these chondrocytes create cartilage. That cartilage forms the model, or the beginning structure of your bone. And if you'll notice that they said specifically it's hyaline cartilage. And if you go back to Unit 2 when we talked about submorting connective tissue, hyaline cartilage is the type of cartilage that forms on your bone joints. So all of this blue is hyaline cartilage. Right here, what they were describing a second ago, is those chondrocytes right here actually form what is called, they go through hypertrophy, which is they grow and they grow and they grow, and they actually end up calcifying, because if you notice right here, those osteoblasts on the outside have been turning the cartilage on the outside into the diaphysis, or bone shaft here. Well, that actually starts to choke off the nutrients for these in the middle here, which causes them to actually calcify.
Begin to resorb some of the surrounding cartilage matrix. As these chondrocytes enlarge, the matrix begins to calcify, and chondrocytes begin to die, as nutrients cannot diffuse through the newly formed calcified matrix. Next, stem cells within the perichondrium divide to form osteoblasts, and a compact bone collar is formed around the calcified cartilage shaft. A periosteal bud, consisting of capillaries and osteoblasts, invades the core of the cartilaginous shaft.
Now, what you have to understand is if you want bone to actually grow, you have to have nutrients such as calcium, oxygen for the bone cells, phosphorus to form the calcium phosphate matrix. You have to have a way for the products or the waste products to get out. That system of transportation are your blood vessels. So your blood vessels actually have to penetrate this primary ossification center so they can start providing the nutrients necessary in order for this process to even occur,
forming a primary ossification center. The remains of the calcified cartilage serve as a template on which osteoblasts can build bone. Bone development extends toward the epiphyses from the primary ossification center.
This is what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about bone grows from the middle out. So these bone building cells are using all of the nutrients necessary inside here from the blood vessels to start building that bone tissue. Remember, you have the compact bone on the outside and it forms a spongy bone on the inside. And also on the inside, as it's being formed, you also have the osteoclasts that are remodeling or dissolving that bone to form the medullary cavity. But it moves in this direction here, and also in a downward direction, which extends the length of the bones because the cartilage up here, the chondrocytes up here are continually making cartilage. So then it grows in this direction also because of the cartilage forming more and more model for the bone to be made.
Most primary ossification centers are formed by the 12th week of development. The same basic process.
Just so you know, 12th week of development, you can't even determine gender of a baby until typically the 15th or to 18th week of development. So your skeletal system forms before actual visual indication of gender of a baby.
Of primary ossification is repeated in the epiphyses as secondary ossification centers are formed.
So if you notice, what happens is before the bone grows all the way to the very, very end, you end up with secondary ossification centers. So you have blood vessels that have penetrated the centers up here. So these chondrocytes have become trapped and they no longer receive nutrients, and the blood vessels penetrate that area, and so osteoblasts start building bone here. The thing I want you to recognize is the fact that there's still leftover cartilage up here, and there's leftover cartilage here in the middle, between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. This cartilage up here is what's going to form your articular cartilage. This cartilage right here is what actually ends up forming the growth plate of your bones,
replacing the calcified cartilage with mostly spongy bone. As the secondary ossification centers are formed, osteoclasts resorb bone within the diaphysis, creating a hollow medullary cavity. When secondary ossification is complete, the cartilage is totally replaced by bone, except in two places. A region of cartilage remains over the surface of the epiphyses as the articular cartilage, and another area of cartilage remains between the epiphyses and diaphysis. This is known as the growth region or epiphyseal plate.
You will hear the epiphyseal plate, also called the epiphyseal cartilage,
and is the point from which all growth in bone length occurs. At adulthood, epiphyseal cartilage plates are completely ossified, and bone growth stops.
Okay, so let's move on a little bit. There are a lot of factors that actually contribute to the bone growth process within the body within the womb and outside the womb. But we're going to talk mostly now about what happens to bone growth when you're post-birth, I guess you could say. So there's two major time frames which your body grows really, really rapidly. You have right after birth, and then you have puberty. So what happens is sex hormones are what actually accelerate the process of bone growth. That is done through the use of the epiphyseal cartilage or epiphyseal plate. So that cartilage that is there is used to actually cause osteoblasts to increase activity and cause the bones to extend in length. What that does, though, is as that cartilage is turned to more and more bone, that epiphyseal plate or epiphyseal cartilage becomes thinner and thinner and thinner. Once that epiphyseal cartilage is gone, your bones grow no more. When the epiphyseal cartilage disappears, you no longer have an epiphyseal plate. Instead, what you have is an epiphyseal line. It's a very thin line that indicates no more epiphyseal cartilage is present. What this allows us to do, believe it or not, is we can actually determine the age of certain skeletons. Let's say we found a skeleton out in the middle of Francis L. North football field, and it's been there for years and years and years. They want to know the gender, the age. Well, there's various things they can do. One of the big things they do to determine age is they actually take x-rays of those bones, and they're examining to see if there's an epiphyseal plate or an epiphyseal line. An epiphyseal plate, in the amount of epiphyseal plate, can help indicate the relative age of that individual in addition to the length of whichever bone they're x-raying. If there's an epiphyseal line present, they have an estimated age of that individual that typically occurs above puberty or adolescence. Now, so we've kind of gone over what your bones need in order to grow, but there's certainly other things that are necessary. So normal bone growth, you always know that it requires calcium to form the matrix and phosphorus, which is that other, or phosphate, which is the other mineral deposits, but there's other things that actually are required that are kind of secondary. For example, you know milk has vitamin D in it. Well, vitamin D is actually necessary in order for your body to actually process calcium in the digestive system. So you take in vitamin D, and what happens is vitamin D is actually processed using sunlight. So in order for you to process vitamin D, you have to absorb sunlight or UV radiation. Then what happens is it changes, and then it allows your digestive system to absorb calcium into the body. Let's say that you have a very, 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 very limited amount of vitamin D in your diet, particularly when you're young. You can actually form what is called a disease called rickets. And it causes your your bones to be very soft and bendable, and this is one of the #1 results in bow-leggedness in individuals, where the legs form and bend in an outward direction or lateral directions, forming a bow-legged look. It's because your bones in those individuals were soft and bendable, and they actually formed in that bend direction due to the weight of the body. With vitamin C is actually used to help with the osteoblasts. The bone building cells are the major contributors or users of vitamin C in the body. So let's say you had a decreased amount of vitamin C in your body. What that then ends up with, you end up with a disease called scurvy. When you have very, very low amounts of vitamin C in the body, you have osteoblasts that do not perform as well or not at all, which then you have an increased function of an increased usage of osteoclasts, which causes your bones to become brittle. So that's scurvy. Believe it or not, scurvy used to be highly associated with pirates or the Navy because vegetables and fruits, which are high in vitamin C, are hard to keep on ships for long periods of time because they go bad. So you would find a lot of naval crews and pirates and things like that would actually develop scurvy because of the fact that they don't have a diet high in vitamin C. Okay. Just a neat picture here. What you have is you can see that these are the long bones of a human in the womb. You'll notice that they do not connect yet where they're supposed to, or where they're supposed to articulate, because in the middle here those bones are still growing lengthways until they reach the actual articulation points, which would be at the wrist. I think that's crazy. Flat bones here is the ribs. You'll notice other ossification centers. You'll notice that you really can't see the definitive skull bones here that haven't gone through intramembranous ossification. Here, the femur doesn't fully reach the knee or the hip because it actually hasn't gone through that endochondral ossification process yet. Even creepier picture is, and you can see it's occurring here. You see how there's almost nothing in the joint of that knee, and it's because here the femur, the tibia, fibula have not gone through that entire process yet. What I wanted to show you here, this is the head of the humerus. This is where the humerus, or your upper arm bone, actually attaches to the shoulder. And what you'll see here is this right here is the epiphyseal plate. This is a section of cartilage. And then there's cartilage around the outside here, which is the articular cartilage that is formed from that endochondral ossification, this would have been the secondary ossification site, and then down below, down here, which the primary ossification site grew and grew and grew up in here. This little section here of cartilage is what contributes to the human skeleton growth in terms at the age of puberty. As that slowly turns into bone, the bone grows this way, oops, sorry, and this way down, and as that does, that line gets thinner and thinner and thinner. That plate gets thinner. Once it gets thin enough to form a line, boom, done growing, that's it. If you have epiphyseal lines, if the doctor said, hey, let's figure out if you're still growing, took an x-ray of your bones, they see an epiphyseal line, doctors say, unfortunately, Rafi, you're done growing, which for me happened in the 8th grade. I haven't grown, I've been this tall since it was in the 8th grade. And it sucks. So, it leads us to entrance card question number 1. Keep in mind, write the question on one side and the answer on the other, but on the next slide, you're going to notice there are 2 diagrams representing the steps of there's diagrams representing the steps of endochondral ossification. The diagrams for this are in the actual correct order, so when you see the pictures, they're in the correct sequential order from left to right. However, the phrases above them that are labeled A, B, C, D, and E are not in the correct order. Based on the pictures, I want you to sort the phrases in the correct order. So if you look down here, these are the diagrams representing endochondral ossification, and up here are the actual steps, but these steps are in a jumbled order. I need for you to rewrite these steps in the correct order. And then entrance card question number 2. So below you have 2 x-ray images. This is of the knee joint. So this bone right here would be the femur, and this is also the femur. Down here you would have your tibia, and down here you would have your tibia. One of these x-ray images was taken when the patient was 9 years old, and the other x-ray image was taken when the patient was 27 years old. Which x-ray do you suppose fits at the age of 9? And which x-ray fits at the age of 27? And make sure you explain or point out how you know that answer. This is the end of the Part 1 notes. So, Part 1C notes. Please let me know if you have any questions.